All right, welcome back to our last episode of Intro to Incident Response, celebrating Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And we are on the last step of the SANS incident response cycle, lessons learned. So, lessons learned is about reviewing everything that you have done. By now, you've gone through the full cycle, you have scoped everything, you identified what an incident was, you were able to contain and then eventually eradicate an attacker, and hopefully had a successful recovery. Um, Lessons learned is about going through each one of those steps now that the dust has sort of settled a little bit, the level is a little bit down, people are a little calmer, but not so far out from it that you don't remember the details and you don't think there's anything to improve on. Lessons learned is about identifying what could have been done better. Was there confusion? What went well? Like, it's important to celebrate the wins, right? So if we go back to our normal like Ford lists exercise in life, we talk about what's good, what's bad, what was missing, and what was confusing. So what are the things that you could have had that would have made life easier during it? Maybe celebrate the wins where they were, because if you got to a successful recovery, that's a win. Congratulations, that's good. But mostly, what was confusing? Like, confusion is usually going to be the biggest segment to kind of work through. And ultimately, it'll come down to practice and planning to work through confusion. But that's what lessons learned is about. You're going to be looking for technical improvements, right? So, did you have collection blind spots? Was there a problem with how long it took to actually detect that incident? Is there something you could do to improve the situation so you can either catch it sooner or make it easier to find during the threat hunt, or identify the scope a little bit better? When we think about the phases of an intrusion kill chain, right? We talked about the later you detect something, the harder it is to actually solve, and usually the worse off you are. So figure out, where was that initial notification. You work through the four pieces: the initial access, the lateral movement, and all that stuff, and that's really important. Now, if you didn't catch it on initial access, how could you have caught it is the question that you need to ask. Was there a delivery method that they used that you just weren't monitoring? Was there just too much noise in the monitoring for that delivery method that the signal got lost? Um, was there an exploitation that they used that you weren't scanning for? Like, how did that exist? Does your vuln scan tool not pick it up? Was it a 0 day that no one knew about? Think through some of those problems and try to understand how you can improve on it. Ultimately, there are no perfect tools. You can use the best tooling in the world, and for things like vuln scanning, 0 days will still exist. There's going to be tools that the vuln scanner doesn't know how to deal with and can't find everything. There's going to be bugs in software that it can't check for. So you have to try to figure out what could you have done better during this phase, and ultimately make some decisions on if you should do better. Or if it's just low risk and it was a fluke and you kind of believe that, then maybe that's what it is. Is additional auditing needed? We've seen repeatedly where people are like, no, 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 we have rules on the firewall that would have prevented, inbound connections from these countries that we don't trust, only to find out that maybe in any rule that should exist that should have been a deny rule, right? Or an allow rule should have been, or exist that should have been a deny rule. We've seen lots of situations where people thought they bought a license for a feature that somebody just unchecked the box, or a rule was changed during testing and forgot to get flipped back. These kinds of things happen all the time. Remote access, like raw RDP, is something that we've seen countless times on customer sites where they swear there's no remote access, and when we check the firewall, there it is. 3389 got open to some admin's desktop or some executive's desktop because they really needed remote access just for a few minutes that one time, and it was an emergency, and then it just got forgotten. Auditing is what we use to fix these things over time, right? Do you need additional tooling? Sometimes it's just you didn't have the information because there was nothing there to catch it. And as a pro tip, budgets often open up sometimes after compromises. So if you're on the tail end of a compromise and you can come back and say, in a reasonable amount of time, that this tooling would have prevented this, purse strings get a little looser around this time, right? So think through that. Don't take too long. Don't take advantage, maybe, but be realistic about what is needed to prevent this kind of stuff in the future. And don't let anybody fall into the trap of, well, it just happened, it's not going to happen again. No, it's going to happen again if you got compromised. Absolutely. So make sure you're taking this time to look for technical improvements. Um, Beyond technical improvements, also look for non-technical improvements. Process improvements are a big one, right? You need to understand, how was communication? Did everything kind of flow smoothly? Was tension really high? Was there a lot of confusion? Did everybody know their role and were they able to execute on that? This training, when I originally designed it, was the result of a postmortem because we were working with a client through an incident. At the end of the incident, we realized that they had an incident response plan, but they didn't do sufficient training with the people who needed to be involved on the system ownership side. So while the security team was aware and they knew who to call, when it came time to actually work with system owners and data owners, there was a lot of confusion about finding who those people were and getting them online in the middle of the night when it was necessary, and who could make the decision to take something offline and understand the impact of that stuff. So this kind of training was originally developed to help with people who don't do incident response for a living, and getting them queued up and helping them understand that when the time comes, if their systems get compromised, here's how it'll look to them. And it's really important to not forget that as part of your training, right? Like, you spend the time training your infosec team on how to do incident response. You need to remember to train all of your system administrators, all of your stakeholders. Your legal team needs to understand that there may be a point in time where you need to come to them and say, "Hey, what is our reporting responsibility if there's a breach that that has this type of compliance based data? Who do we need to report to? What frequency do we need to report in? What is the minimum threshold for reporting? How long do we have before we can send a report? When do we need to notify customers? All that kind of stuff is stuff that your legal teams, your marketing team, your PR team maybe need to be engaged. They need to be part of this planning and this training. The worst thing that can happen is you need these people and they just don't understand who's calling them, because often, especially in large organizations, they're never going to work with your infosec team. You're going to be a stranger on the phone unless you make an intentional attempt to bring people and bring them in on these kinds of plans. So make sure that you're doing training and that you're helping everybody. And that goes back to that step one, right? That's preparing. So in your lessons learned, if you find that people just weren't really sure what to do, add that to your next preparation cycle. So the other thing that we found over time was people needed help understanding how to communicate during incident response. And that's kind of a weird thing to say. But I put together a couple of tips because I found these to be helpful. Um, Incident response communication is different. If you're part of a normal sysadmin team, a lot of the time when you're working on a problem like an outage, it's very persistent in effort. You're working on an issue, people are troubleshooting, you're hunting for that problem. Um, that means that the cadence is pretty standard. It's go, 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 go until the problem is solved, then it's done. Or until there's a natural stop, right? You say, okay, we found the problem. We're going to wait 3 days for parts. We'll see you in 3 days. The cadence with incident response in security is a little bit different because we go through that scoping cycle, right? Where we find IOCs and everybody's kind of investigating, and then people kind of step away and have to go hunting. So during that hunt, there's not always things for everybody to do, but if you don't communicate that there's going to be kind of a pause, or you don't set a check-in cycle, you end up in these really awkward situations where sysadmins who are used to that go 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 go, there's a problem, something's down, get it back online mentality, are sort of left in this jittery panicky feel while they wait for an update. And that can be really hard if you're used to being on a team that is uptime reliant. Security scoping is difficult. There's patience. There's, like, you have this thing where you could probably take an action, but it's not the right thing to do right now because you got to continue scoping. Set a cadence. Say, hey, we're going to meet every 4 hours for a check-in. We're going to meet every 8 hours for a check-in. We're going to have a bridge open, but we only need these people online right now. Everybody else, check back in 4 hours and we'll get you an update. Those types of cadences need to be kind of set up front. And it's going to be different per incident and per company. Um, you'll also see probably that at the very beginning of an incident, communication is a lot more rapid because you're coming across things a lot faster, right? You're starting to dive in, there's a lot more information, there's a lot less clarity on assignments. But as the incident goes on for hours or days or weeks, unfortunately, sometimes that check-in period goes from, hey, we're talking all the time, to, okay, everybody has their jobs, check back in an hour, to, okay, we kind of have an idea what's going on. We're going to make these changes tonight at 5 p.m. So everybody, we're on break till tonight at 5, to, okay, we're going to check in at 8 a.m. on Saturday to see what's going on, or just this team now needs to check in while this other team starts rebuilding as you enter restore. That interval may change. And the incident commander is who's responsible for communicating that and setting that. So understand what the interval is, understand that you have to communicate that interval, and understand that if you're working with people who are usually uptime based, this can be a nerve-wracking thing as people are hunting, right? They might get antsy and they're like, why aren't we just kicking the bad guy out? You got to make sure everybody kind of is on the same page about what we're doing and why, to prevent frustration and just general antsiness, I'll say. Communication tip number two. We have to be pretty precise when we're communicating during incident, and this can get again difficult depending on the teams you're working with. Um, when you communicate, especially on an incident bridge, we have to be really clear about what you're trying to communicate and why. You need to include context that helps it make sense to people. A lot of times on bridges, people are jumping on and off. They're busy doing something while they're kind of listening in, so it's really easy to kind of not pay attention for a second while you're maybe digging in a sim log or looking over a firewall log. And then you hear a keyword and you kind of perk back up and you're like, hey, what's going on? So you have to be very clear about if what you're saying is data, so a factual piece of information, it's I saw a connection from IP address X to IP address Y at this time. That's a factual piece of data, right? It's an IP address, it's one of your IOCs. Um, if you're providing analysis, it's your interpretation of what's going on. I think the attacker is based out of China. Okay, like you're going to need to provide some data to support that analysis, right? Otherwise, it's just sort of your opinion on things. Um, you could be including a hypothesis with that, or like make sure that's very clear. What if the attacker is doing this to steal this piece of data? That's a hypothesis. And unless you have supporting information, it may or may not be relevant. It could be confusing, but you want to make sure people aren't latching on to hypothesis and analysis as fact sometimes. You might say, hey, I'm really concerned that the attacker compromised our password server. That's a valid concern. You should check that, but you need to make sure that wasn't understood as, hey, our password server was compromised. Those kinds of small differences and nuances can lead people down very, very deep rabbit holes very quickly and raise the level of panic unnecessarily. And when you have a question, make sure it's clear that it's a question and help people understand why you're asking that question. And wait for the appropriate time. Don't if people like on a bridge, especially as bridges get larger and you have 5 or 10 or 15 or 30 people on a bridge, it's very easy to start talking over each other. So help establish the lines of communication. Questions are often better to be thrown in a chat so that way they can be responded to and not talked over others. They also get documented answers quicker that way, so it helps with documentation a lot. Um, General discussion is best for voice, though. I don't really like doing incident response over chat. I think it's slower when you're just trying to have a discussion or talk through things, but you'll have to find your own rhythm with your own team. But either way, be clear about what you're doing. Be very clear about what type of data you're providing and why. And when you have questions, make sure you're clear that it's a question and help provide some context so people understand how to give you the data you need. And last but not least, understand that depending on the kind of incident, you need to be prepared to use out of band communication. If you think you have an email server compromise, using email is a terrible idea because the attacker can see what you're doing, right? If you're a Microsoft 365 customer and you think your tenant is compromised, you probably don't want to be using Microsoft Teams to communicate with your incident response people because you don't know who has access to that data at that point. So have a plan for out of band communication. Have a plan for sharing files and those spreadsheets of doom we talked about for IOCs and sharing documentation relevant to the investigation in a manner that is outside the scope of that incident. And it's really important, especially in the beginning, to start out in something that's isolated and secure because you don't know what the scope is yet. So be sure that your communication plans are documented as part of your incident response plan. The last thing you need is trying to get people into, WebEx if you usually use Teams, or on a actual phone bridge if you're doing a conference call or something like that. A lot of times, incident response companies, if you're paying a third party like Black Hills, like Talos, like Mandiant, a lot of them will provide a secure channel for you to share data with them, and it's usually best to just jump into their channel and start using that if it's possible. That gets you completely out of the environment that is potentially compromised and into a secure space to start managing data and communicating effectively. And that kind of wraps it up. That covers the SANS incident response cycle, right? We took you all the way through preparation. That's the training. So hopefully now you take some of this information as part of your preparation. You share it with your team. You share it with whoever might benefit from it within your group. In the event you do run into your next incident, go through the steps, identify what's going on, make sure you're dealing with an incident and everybody that kind of understands what that means. Activate your incident response plan when it's appropriate. It's okay to have different plans for minor incidents versus major incidents, right? Like not everything requires a call to the CISO typically, but understand when that where that line is and when that needs to be activated. Make sure you're going through your scoping process thoroughly. Otherwise, you can end up playing whack-a-mole, and this cycle just turns into a endless loop and not the end of an incident. Your containment phase is when you start locking things down, protecting your environment a little bit, maybe slowing the attacker until you can finally move on to eradication, where you're making that bad guy go bye bye. And then once that's done and you're sure that person is out of your network and that attacker is gone, you move into recovery. And hopefully you remember what we talked about disaster recovery planning. You need to know when you can restore from, how long that'll take, prioritize those restore plans, and then ultimately circle back to lessons learned, talk about what went well, what was confusing, what was missing, what was bad, and then start your preparation all over again. You should be visiting these plans at least annually. This is not something that should get dusty on a shelf. Um, don't forget, there's fun games out there, right? Like Backdoors and Breaches, a super fun game. Like I said, I keep decks of it everywhere. So if you see me at a conference, come up and ask me. I probably have a deck in my backpack that you can have. But order yourself some. They're on the Black Hills website. Um, it's a super fun game to practice incident response and just get people talking about it. It's a little more fun than just maybe a PowerPoint deck or a binder that has some writing in it. Engage with your team though. Practice this stuff. Talk through it. Go through scenarios. Build out fun scenarios. I might even make a video about building out scenarios for this kind of stuff. But ultimately, the more you prepare, the more you analyze your lessons learned, the better off you'll be when it comes time to react to an incident. So good luck. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. But have a great night and thanks for watching.